purpose of music in worship is not the music. The purpose of music in worship is not to glorify the performers. The purpose of music in worship is the image of God closing the circle and giving back to God what has been given to us. The purpose of music in worship is to bring God closer to our consciousness. I don't know about you, but I felt that tonight. And I thank God for a beautiful opening to genuine worship today. With that in mind, got a gift for you. Some dear friends of mine rented a trailer and dragged a bunch of copies up here, and they are first come, first served, no charge. It's conversations about God, the very thing we were just talking about. It's one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen. There's color on every page. So it's good for the coffee table, but it's even better to read. If you'd like a copy, they'll be distributed behind the tent over here, and you can go and get those afterward. As I said, first come, first serve, but I think we have enough for tonight. So just looking around, and if you're watching on the video and you'd like to have a copy too, you can just go to the website pineknoll.org. That's Pine Knoll with a K, K-N-O-L-L, and request your free copy, and it will be sent to you. So anyway, but those of you who are here, you can walk away with it. So our topic this week is Adventist identity. I think when the Adventist movement began back in the middle of the 19th century, people had a pretty good idea of who we were. But life has moved on. Generations have passed. And I find today more and more people in the pews struggling to understand, what is the purpose? Why are we here? Why another denomination? And if you're here and you're not a Seventh-day Adventist, welcome. So glad that you can be here with us. You might want to just sit back and relax and say, hey, this is not about me. Let me see what's wrong with these people. And let me see maybe what I can learn as well. So welcome and come along with us. But I'll be speaking particularly to the issues of Adventist identity. What is the mission and purpose of the Adventist movement in today's world? And our topic tonight, as you can see on the screen, is the biggest story ever told. And that biggest story isn't about my son. All right? And if anybody's worried, you're away from your home and everybody knows where you are, that's not a good thing, right? Well, just try to visit my son in the home and see how far you get. He's way bigger than me, and he looks scary. So we're not worried about the house while we're gone. But this is my son at his last birthday, and the reason I'm featuring him is because he has quite a presence online, and he's helped me actually develop a new website, which is called thebattleofarmageddon.com. I can't believe it, but that line was available, so we took it and created a website to share materials with people there. But that's not what we're about tonight. You see, my son, his name is Joel, and all of his life he's been somewhat fascinated with online gaming. I can't say I'm the most enthusiastic supporter of that activity myself, okay? But the interesting thing is, in these communities, he encounters a lot of young people that you'll never see in church, or maybe used to see in church. And what has really amazed him is how many of his friends, online friends, consider themselves atheists, but also consider themselves ex-Christians and ex-Seventh-day Adventists. So Christians of various backgrounds, but also a number of Seventh-day Adventists, ex-Seventh-day Adventists, atheists. I have challenged comprehending that, and of course he, I think, also did, meeting with post-Christian and post-Adventist youth. And he asks them, when he comes to be aware of this, to say, what was it? What caused that shift? What caused you to move from this place to that place? Because he struggles with that. He says, I don't know how I would survive without the God that I know through the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So he's asking the question, and it's interesting, there was a common theme. Every single time, there were two things that were the reason, that were the precipitates between being a faithful follower of God in a Christian denomination and being an atheist. And those two things were, first of all, the picture of God that they got in church. A God who was scary, judgmental, punishing, exacting, in some cases cruel. The picture of God that they received in church was a strong incentive. If that's what God is like, I don't want to have anything to do with him. The second precipitant is how they were treated in church growing up. I don't want to depress anybody tonight, just want to be in reality. Whatever, we are operating in tonight, we want to be in the real world and recognize that if faith doesn't make a difference in the real world, then it isn't much use. Because churches are created for the specific purpose of spreading the picture of God through the world. And if we've got that wrong ourselves, it's a serious problem. So that's my son's report. And as I thought about his report, I said, is there a remedy here? Is there a way forward? Is there something we can know or something we can do that can make a difference with this younger generation? And I came to realize that Seventh-day Adventists do have a special contribution to the world. It's almost unique. It isn't totally unique, but it's almost unique. And that contribution is the great controversy. The idea that there is a cosmic conflict, that the little challenges we face every day are part of a much bigger struggle, a universal conflict between good and evil. The biggest story ever told. That this is a significant contribution. Now, there's been people in the past, like Origen, the early church father of Alexandria, actually the Quran. Don't know if you knew that or not, but the Quran has a lot of this idea of God against Satan, a battle between good and evil, a universal conflict. You have in the Middle Ages the famous Dante, who reflected on it quite a bit. John Milton, the English poet. You have C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, the famous author of Lord of the Rings, etc. There have been people throughout Christian history who taught this. And because Origen is only about 100 years after the New Testament, his testimony suggests the early church very much understood this theme as well. When it comes to the Bible, the crucial text of the cosmic conflict is Revelation chapter 12. And so that's going to be our focus tonight. Revelation chapter 12. And if you have a Bible with you, whether that's on your phone, or on a tablet, or you got your laptop with you, or the good old physical page. I like books. That's why we're giving one away tonight. But I think it's so exciting to be able to pick up the Word in whatever form and to follow it through. By the way, here's some of those people that I just mentioned: Origen of Alexandria, the Quran, Dante, Inferno, Milton. There was a preacher, Westminster Abbey in London in the 19th century, Henry Melville. And Ellen G. White was very fond of Melville's preaching. And he had a lot to say about the cosmic conflict. And of course, we've mentioned C.S. Lewis, Tolkien. And then today, Gregory Boyd, who I believe is a Baptist, has done some fabulous work on the cosmic conflict. But let's do our own work in the Scriptures tonight and go to Revelation 12. And Revelation 12 takes us from the birth of Jesus to the final events of Earth's history. It's a big story. In fact, you could say it's the biggest story ever told. There are three characters introduced in Revelation 12, verses 1 to 5. And there's a little secret to tell you, that there's a literary strategy that I've discovered in my study of Revelation, and I've shared it in scholarly circles, and I want to share it with you today. And that is, when you're reading the book of Revelation, pay attention whenever a new character appears in the story. Because the Apostle John seemed to have a conscious literary strategy that whenever a new character appears, it's like he hits the pause button. You know, like you have in your electronics stuff, you have a pause button. You say, okay, let me hold it right there for a sec. John hits the pause button in the vision. Notice the vision freezes, and he takes a moment to describe this new character physically, a visual description of what the character looks like. And then he takes a moment to give the backstory. Now you see this happening in plays and in movies and things like that. When a new character appears, maybe there's a voiceover or you see a subtitle or something that gives you an idea who this character is, what their background is, so that you can fit them into the story. Well, this happens in Revelation 12, that John, whenever a new character appears, offers a visual description and then a summary of previous history, a backstory to that character. So let's take a look at the characters in Revelation 12. First of all, you have the woman. And you see her here, artistic depiction of a woman standing on the moon with 12 stars, a crown of 12 stars on her head, and shining with the sun. Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. A great sign was seen in heaven. A woman dressed with the sun. The moon was under her feet, and upon her head a victory crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant, and she cried out in pain as she labored to give birth. All right, now I'm going to just pay attention to the screen for a moment, and I'm going to change the colors, because a new character has appeared in the story. And what's the first thing John does with the new character? Visual description. A woman dressed with the sun, the moon was under her feet, upon her head was a victory crown of 12 stars. Right, so that's a visual description of what this character is like. And then it says, backstory, she's pregnant and cried out in pain as she labored to give birth. So that's the backstory to what John is about to tell us. He's going to share the birth of that child and what happens after that. So that's the story. Okay, but the background to the story is she's already pregnant and she's in labor. So who's this woman? Well, in our traditional understanding of it, the woman here represents Old Testament Israel that gave birth to Christ when he came. And that's a good explanation, but I think there's more to the story than that. So we'll come back to it. Second character is the dragon. So a new character appears, a dragon. It says, another sign was seen in heaven, a great fiery red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his head 7 crowns. His tail dragged down a third of the stars of heaven, threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who's about to give birth, in order that when her child was born, he might eat it up. All right, again, I'll shift the colors. And you'll see in verse 3, once again, a visual description. A great fiery red dragon, 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his heads 7 crowns. All right, you have the picture. You have a vision of what this character is like, and then it gives a backstory. His tail dragged down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. That's an event way in the past. This dragon is the one who drags stars out of heaven, which in Revelation are called angels. And then the dragon stood before the woman who's about to give birth, in order that when her child was born, he might eat it up. Generally, the interpretation goes something like this. This dragon represents Satan, who drew a third of the angels out of heaven at the beginning of this cosmic conflict. So it goes all the way back to the beginning here. But there's also a glimpse of Rome. Do you remember Herod? When Jesus was born, Herod became intimidated by that, and he tried to destroy Jesus. And all the babies of Bethlehem died, and Jesus escaped, fortunately. But he was trying to destroy Jesus. So there's echoes of these 2 stories. The story of the great conflict in heaven back at the beginning, and also the story of Jesus' arrival and the threat coming from Rome. So those are good historical interpretations. But I do think there's even more to the story, and that's what we want to look at tonight. The third character is a male child. Revelation 12, verse 5. It says, she, the woman, gave birth to a son, a male child, who's about to shepherd all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. So character number 3 is this male child. And again, I highlight the story. It's a child who's about to shepherd the nations with a rod of iron. Is there something missing here? There's no visual description. I've got a photo there of what a baby looks like, but there's no visual of this male child, just announced. And there's no backstory either. Doesn't say anything about his past. Instead, it talks about his future. What's going on here? Why isn't John doing what he's done so many times before in chapter 1 and in chapter 11 and chapter 12? Why is that? I suggest that it is because this character was in the story before, not as a baby, but in some other form. You see, in the book of Revelation, multiple characters can represent the same entity in reality. In other words, you can have more than one character in Revelation that are all focused on the same historical entity. For example, Jesus is called Jesus in Revelation. It's called the Son of Man. It's called the Lamb. And he's also, I would say, the male child in this story. So he doesn't need a visual or an introduction because he's been in the story before. Satan is called a dragon is called a serpent and several other things. The church can be represented by the woman, the remnant, and also several other things. So the male child then is Jesus. It's the story of his birth and the story of his ascension to heaven. So let's do a summary, historical summary, the historical interpretation of chapter 12 so far. The woman represents Israel, both Old and New Testament Israel. The dragon represents Satan and Rome. And the baby represents the earthly Jesus. And those are good explanations. You've heard them before, I suspect. I've given them myself. But as I read the story again, it suddenly hit me. Let's not leave the story just yet. Because the story itself moves us in a direction that enlightens us, I think, for the topic we have tonight. We sometimes, in studying Revelation, jump too quickly into history and miss what's going on in the story itself. This story has three characters so far: the dragon, the woman, the male child. So let's stay with the story and see what happens next. Where do the woman and the dragon go next? How does the story move forward? Verse 6, the woman fled into the desert, where she has a place prepared for her by God, in order that she might be nourished there for 1,260 days. So the woman flees the place. The male child is snatched up to heaven. The woman flees from that location into the wilderness. And notice there's no mention of the dragon here. Doesn't say the dragon chased her into the wilderness. She flees into the wilderness, and there she's sheltered. There she's protected. And for the moment, we don't have time to pursue the woman, because I want to follow the dragon and see what happens there. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels gathered to fight against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels also fought. Now follow the movement in this story, moving from verse 5 to 6 to 7. The dragon follows the child up to heaven. In the story, follows the child up to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, war breaks out in heaven. After he's cast out of heaven, he then pursues the woman in the wilderness. When you come back in verses 13 and 14, which we can't cover tonight, but you get back to verses 13 and 14, and he pursues the woman into the wilderness. It repeats verse 6, but now the dragon's involved in the story again. So the woman flees into the wilderness. Meantime, on a different stage, the dragon pursues the male child to heaven, and war breaks out there. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels gathered to fight against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels also fought. And the dragon was not strong enough, neither was a place found in heaven for them. So I think most of us are familiar with the war in heaven back at the beginning. But Revelation 12 tells us that there was a second iteration of this conflict at the time of the ascension of Jesus. The conflict is renewed once more, and Satan this time is cast out for good. And we'll pursue that a little more in just a moment. But first of all, let's ask the question, who's this Michael? Suddenly, no more male child. In fact, the male child doesn't appear again in the book of Revelation. Mentioned just once in verse 5, ascends to heaven and disappears from the story. Instead, fighting against the dragon is not the male child, but Michael. And what do you notice here in these verses about Michael? No visual description. The artist kind of gives him a description, but there's none in the text itself. No backstory. Why? Because Michael's been in the story before. Michael is another symbol for Jesus Christ. The head, the archangel, the head of all the angels in the battle against Satan. So there is war in heaven. When Jesus goes to heaven, Satan comes to stake his claim. And we'll see how that turns out in just a moment. So why is there no visual and no history? Because he's appeared in the story before in other forms. So the dragon followed the male child into heaven, and the conflict that was happening on earth now focuses once more on heaven. And the great dragon, the ancient serpent, the one called devil and Satan, who deceives the whole inhabited world, he was thrown down into the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. I want you to notice something there. That the dragon is also the ancient serpent, is also the devil, is also Satan, is also the one who deceives the entire world. So you see, there's more than one character in the story, and yet representing a single entity in the reality of things. So the book of Revelation, this has helped me so much in understanding Revelation. If you try to see each character as a unique detail and try to figure it all out, it gets very, very complicated. But when you begin to realize that some of the characters are giving another picture of the same basic entity, things start to clarify a little bit. So there was war in heaven, and Satan and his angels were losers. And notice it calls Satan the ancient serpent. What does that remind you of? The Garden of Eden, said someone. Yes, absolutely. It's an allusion to Genesis 3. What was the conflict like in Genesis 3? Here we have conflict at the beginning in heaven. We have conflict of the birth of Jesus. We have conflict in heaven at his ascension. What was the conflict like in the garden? It was Satan telling lies about God. What's the context of those lies? The enthronement of Jesus Christ. What happens in verse 10 is the enthronement of Jesus Christ in heaven. He ascends to heaven, and there is acclaimed as the king of this earth. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now have come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ, for the accuser of our brothers, the one who accuses them before the throne of God day and night, has been cast down." So back at the beginning, Satan was cast out of heaven physically. But we know from Scripture that he still had a visitor's visa. Right? Because in the book of Job, he shows up in heaven again. And what is he doing? He's accusing Job. And he's accusing God. That's what he does in heaven. And the accuser of our brothers has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and did not love their lives even unto death. So what you see here is the moment of chapter 12, verses 10 and 11, is the moment when Jesus ascends to heaven. It's the moment when his work on earth is recognized. It's the moment of the cross. That's the moment of this renewed battle in heaven. And Satan is cast down in light of the cross as the accuser of the brothers. So Jesus Christ is Michael, is the male child, and he's enthroned in heavenly places. When was the casting down? At the time of Jesus' ascension and enthronement. So there's a second casting down of Satan. The first time he was cast out physically. The second time he is cast out from influence in heaven. You see, after the cross, Satan had no more influence in heaven. Everybody there was fully convinced of who he was and who Jesus was and where the truth lies. On this earth, it's not yet so clear. But at that point, Satan was cast out of influence in heaven. We find this in John chapter 12 as well, where Jesus said, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this earth be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." Jesus ties the casting down of Satan to what? His being lifted up on the cross. That something happened at the cross that forever ended Satan's influence in heaven. The casting down of Satan. Of course, we see that also in Revelation 5, where Jesus is enthroned in heavenly places. And Satan has no place in chapter 5. He's gone from the heavenly scene. So we see a tremendous war, a tremendous conflict taking place in heaven. But that doesn't tell us what that conflict is all about. What kind of war is this? Because I think there's sometimes confusion on that. What kind of war is going on at the beginning in heaven? What kind of war in heaven was going on in light of the cross? Was it lightsabers? No? How about arm wrestling? No? Option 3, a war of words. A war of words. You see, the battle in heaven is not a physical conflict. If the issue was who is stronger, God or Satan, no issue. If it was about power, if it was about military strength, God could end this thing in a moment. It's not about power. It's about something else. It's a war of words. It's a conflict over ideas. Let me give you the evidence for that. Let's take it right from the text. First of all, in verse 4, the dragon dragged a third of the angels out of heaven with his tail. What's that all about? Well, in the Old Testament, there was this theme of a tail, well illustrated by Isaiah 9:15. The elder and the honored man is the head. The prophet who teaches lies is the tail. The tail of the dragon was not physical force, drag angels out of heaven. The dragon convinced a third of the angels to leave. They believed his lies. He was telling lies about God. The cosmic conflict is a war of words about the character of God, what God is really like. Remember what my son said? One of the most destructive things a church can do is give a false picture of God Because people will believe if you're part of a church, you're talking for God. God must be like whatever you say he is. And if we give a false picture of God, people are just led into Satan's trap, even in church. So the key issue in this conflict is truth versus lies. And that's a battle over the character of God. Satan says one thing, God says another. Who's telling the truth? And in a court of law, when it's one word against another, it's not always easy to make a decision. That's why the conflict isn't over overnight. This is a conflict that takes time for people to learn and understand. In verse 9, Satan is called that ancient serpent, an allusion to Genesis 3, where he was telling lies about God. You see the pattern? Telling lies about God. In verse 10, he's called the accuser of the brothers and the sisters. His essential role in the conflict is accusation. False accusation. The accuser of the brothers and sisters. Remember what he did to Job? God says Job is an upright man, and Satan was throwing one thing after another of accusation. So it's an echo of the book of Job, the accuser of the brothers and the sisters. And then verse 11 says, they overcame him by the word of their testimony. You see, the cosmic conflict is not a battle of tanks and planes and bombs and missiles. If it was about power, God could end it in a moment. But it's about something much more challenging. Who's telling the truth? What is right and what is wrong? What is God truly like? And Revelation illustrates the weapons in that conflict. The weapons on God's side are blood, the cross, word, and self-sacrifice. Those are God's weapons. Satan's weapons are intimidation, deception, accusation. You see, what Satan is doing is painting God in light of his own character. He's projecting his character on God. And the tragedy is many people believe that. They believe really that God is the alter ego of Satan. They might not put in those terms, but the character of the God that they worship is much like the character of Satan in the text. So it's a battle over the character of God. What is God truly like? That's where the conflict is fought. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives even unto death. Remember Job? He said, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job's trust in God was so deep that even the worst possible outcome wouldn't shake it. And as we approach the end of Earth's history, there'll be challenges. The Bible's picture of the end is not a pretty one. There'll be challenges for those who live through the end time. But those who trust God, who have come to know God, who've come to know what God is truly like, will not be shaken by anything that comes. Like Job, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. To trust God, to know his character, is to trust him. To not know his character is to be uncertain of whether God can be trusted. So, what is God like? I'll give you the short version. God is like Jesus. Jesus came to this earth to show us what God is like. As it says in John 14, verse 9, which in my opinion is probably the high point of the New Testament. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. In other words, Jesus is saying, the Father is just like me. You know, not every Christian believes that, right? Do we have a sense sometimes of two pictures of God? Maybe a good cop and a bad cop? I remember one time I was in Egypt, and there was an issue with our trip, and police got involved, and we were taken into this place. There was a policeman who was working with us trying to resolve the problem. He was the nicest fellow you could imagine. But he says, you got to talk to the captain. And so I go into the captain's office, and he's not there. So I'm sitting there in a chair in front of the desk. And then the captain comes in this magnificent uniform. He slams the door. He kicks the file cabinets. He pounds the wall a couple of times, sits down, and looks at me and says, how can I help you? That's the good cop, bad cop routine. You know, you kind of play it, you intimidate on the one hand, on the other hand, treat them nice, you know, and you try to get what you want. And of course, I knew what they wanted and wasn't going to provide, so it dragged the thing out for a long time. But the point is, I think sometimes we have that kind of picture of God. Like the God of the Old Testament is this scary bad cop, intimidating, threatening, raising his voice, ready to punish. And then there's Jesus. You say, well, Jesus I can relate to. The good cop, the bad cop. But you see, the New Testament has a different story. The New Testament doesn't portray the Father as this God of the Old Testament, scary. The New Testament says, no, the Father is like Jesus. Jesus came here to show what the Father is like. And the New Testament turns it around. You ask the New Testament, who's Yahweh in the Old Testament? Who's that God on Mount Sinai? And the New Testament says Jesus. Time and again, quotations of Yahweh in the Old Testament are applied to Jesus in the New. So for the New Testament, Jesus is the Yahweh of the Old Testament. And the Father is the God of the New. Because Jesus showed us what the Father is really like. And you know what happened just before John 14:9 when he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father? What was Jesus talking about? Any idea? What did the disciples see? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. What did they see? The foot washing. The foot washing. Where the Master, the King of the universe, knelt down and washed the feet of his disciples. And it says in John 13, Jesus, knowing who he was, knowing where he came from, knowing where he was going, stooped down and began to wash the disciples' feet. The foot washing was not just for us. The foot washing was a picture for the entire universe of what the Father is like. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus is saying, if the Father himself came down and walked this earth as a human being, he would be just like me. Is that the picture you have? It wasn't mine for a long, long time. I definitely had that good cop, bad cop picture of God. I suspect where it might have come from. I was 8 years old, and there was a thunderstorm. This was New York City. New York City has lots of thunderstorms. You know, the lightning flashes, the thunder rolls, etc. An 8-year-old boy, you know where I was in thunderstorms? I was huddled on the floor of the closet in my bedroom, right? You've been there, right? And this is going on, this is terrifying, and my mom walks in the room. And I don't want you to misunderstand, she was a good mom, she loved the Lord all of her life, but even the best of moms can have a bad day. And all I remember on this day is I said, "Mom, why does it have to thunder and lightning like this? This is terrifying. Why does it have to happen?" And as she was leaving the room, she tossed over her shoulder, "God is angry with all those people who are breaking his commandments." Now, what does an 8-year-old boy know? He's broken a few, right? What 8-year-old boy hasn't? And I knew at that point those lightning bolts were coming for me. You see, it made a deep impression on me, even as a young pastor. I love Jesus and I love to talk about Jesus, but some of that stuff in the Old Testament was kind of scary. And it tainted my picture of what God is truly like. It's all about character. And the character, the poster child, you could say, of Satan's character is in chapter 12. What's the issue with Satan in chapter 12? He's an accuser. That's the only thing mentioned. Doesn't talk about anything else. He's the accuser. He's pointing the finger constantly at others. If Satan is the accuser of the brothers and sisters, what does that make God? Is God the encourager of the brothers and sisters? That's the contrast of character. Accuser of the brothers, encourager of the brethren. This is the contrast in character. It shows itself in many ways throughout Scripture. But in Revelation 12, it focuses particularly on this idea of pointing the finger at others rather than taking responsibility oneself. So Satan makes us think that God is like him, that God is pointing the finger, that God is looking for an excuse to crush us like bugs. That's what Satan is like. What are the implications of this? First of all, there's no good cop, bad cop picture of God. My Egyptian policeman friends are not models of what God is like, and I wouldn't expect them to be. But in the Bible, there's one picture of God. When we rightly understand the Bible, God is what Jesus is. What Jesus was in those 3.5 years of his ministry is what God would always be in all circumstances if it were not for the conflict. In the context of the conflict, God sometimes raises his voice. In the context of the conflict, God sometimes allows himself to be misunderstood. But we have no misunderstanding about what Jesus is like in those 3.5 years of ministry. There's one picture of God in the Bible, and God is infinitely powerful, but he's equally gracious. There's also implications for religion and politics. And I'll try not to step any toes tonight, but let me just say this. If there is a cosmic conflict, if every person on earth, if every organization on earth is part of that conflict, it has implications. It means that God is at work in the Democratic Party. And Satan is also at work. God is at work in Islam. And Satan is also at work. God is at work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I know he is. I've seen him. Satan is also at work. You see, human institutions and entities, God is at work in every political party. God is at work in every religion. God is at work in every person. But Satan is also at work. That's what the cosmic conflict is telling us. We are all battlegrounds in this cosmic conflict. That means our ultimate commitment, our ultimate loyalty can never be to a political party or any human institution. Our ultimate loyalty can only be to God. So the cosmic conflict tells me, you become like the God you worship. And here's where it comes home. You become like the God you worship. If your God is gracious and kind and loving and forgiving, you become more and more like that. Don't you want to be like that? But if your God is judgmental and cruel and accusatory and unforgiving, you become more and more like that. That's why people can slaughter children in the name of God. Because their God is like that. And the beauty of it is that when we truly know the God of the Bible, we will become more and more like that. You can't become like God by thinking it or saying it. You become like God by spending time with God, by knowing God. And as you picture the true picture of God, you become more and more like that in your own life. That's the path, I think, that God wants us to be on. Jesus, as we've seen, is the clearest revelation of God. But here's an exciting corollary to that. You and I are the clearest picture of God some people will ever see. My son may be the clearest picture of God that some online atheist gamers will ever see. And I think that's a beautiful thing. When we realize that as we come to know what God is truly like, as we become more and more like that, others will be able to see what God is truly like. When we accuse, when we condemn, when we're constantly looking for faults in everybody, it's because we feel that God is like that. But in Revelation 12, it is Satan who is like that. So the behavior of professing Christians testifies to the character of God. So bringing it full circle, what do we have to say to youthful atheists? If you run into one, a good start is to ask questions. Just say, what happened? How did you come to this place? What difference has it made in your life? Would you recommend it to anyone else? Ask questions. Let them tell their story. It's called active listening. And if you find that they've been hurt in church, you may often find that to be the case, then the only sensible thing is an apology. Even if you had nothing to do with it. It was some church somewhere else. You say, I am so sorry. Because that is not what God is like. You were not given a chance. In fact, I would argue that atheists may be one step closer to a true picture of God. Because when an atheist has rejected a horrible picture of God that they heard in church, God smiles and says, okay, you're one step closer to the truth. It's a different way of looking at these things sometimes, isn't it? But if a person has been hurt by a false picture of God from church, apology is the only appropriate starting point. And recognizing that I'm a believer, but I've also got a lot to learn. An openness to learning, an openness to listening, I think can help soothe, some of the challenges there. And I like to put it this way: God is not the way we have made him out to be. That our picture of God is often far from what God is truly like. And that it was at the foot washing we discover what God is truly like. So the church is a battleground in the cosmic conflict. And Revelation 13 tells us that God is not surprised by the behavior of professing Christians. As Revelation 13, we'll get to that tomorrow. Revelation 13 tells a picture of what the people of God can become when they lose focus on his true character. When they think that God is judgmental and punishing, they begin to torment others who disagree with them. And churches can do that, have done that through history. God is not surprised by that. He predicted it already in the book of Revelation. So I'd like to close with a goal, something to strive for, something I strive for, and I invite you to join me in that. I want my life, as well as my words, to speak well of God. Thank you.